In this episode, we are going to talk about the great human tragedy which accompanied the independence of India and also the partition of the country. As you know that the history of the partition has been studied by historians from different perspectives. Long-term causes or short-term happenings which contributed to the inevitability of the territorial surgery. One can trace back the history of partition to the communal conflict that had started sometime around the 1890s as a consequence of the conflict between the Muslim and the Hindu political elites for power. One can perhaps concentrate also on the decade of the 1940s after the announcement of the partition demand by the Muslim League in 1940. Recently, the historians are concentrating on the human tragedy that I was talking about. At the moment of independence, when Pandit Nehru in the Constituent Assembly was making his famous Tryst with Destiny speech at the stroke of that midnight hour, thousands of people were actually leaving Punjab on the West Punjab villages and East Bengal villages for a new home in independent India. The history of such homeless refugees has begun to be written by scholars by using extensively the literature that has been written on the event later during the 1960s and 70s, both in Bengal and the Punjab.
So, are there any differences in the literature of the Punjab and West Bengal?
Of course, there are differences, and such differences are to some extent linked with the experience of migration itself. If you look at Punjab, there are of course common elements because you know that throughout the decade of the 1940s, especially after the announcement of the direct action program by the Muslim League in 1946, life became insecure. You have the gruesome Noakhali riots in Eastern Bengal. You have similar such riots in the Punjab countryside as well. We have instances of how rural people in the Punjab countryside were leaving their homes and taking shelter in towns like Rawalpindi or Lahore. So, riot and the fear that was generated by communal frenzy had already started pushing people to migrate from their homes. But before the decision was taken to partition the country, nobody thought that this was a kind of a permanent fate that was awaiting them. People wished to go back to their villages, and even if there were riot-torn areas in Eastern Bengal, there was no inkling that the partition was going to create this kind of a tragedy for which people would have to leave their home for an entirely new destination. Now, to talk about the literature, if you look at the North Indian literature from both sides of the border, the Punjabi literature, because there are Muslims who migrated to West Pakistan and wrote about how badly they felt in leaving their country. The North Indian Muslim intellectual elites, the great poets, the writers, the novelists, who had written down their own experiences of the partition in the form of autobiographies or fictions. You have similar such literature for Bengal as well. But if you look at the North Indian literature, there is a certain admission of the brutality of the event. I mean, think of Bhishma Sahani's Tamas, and which has been turned into a very significant television serial. You can see the brutality. This kind of admission of brutality or the acceptance of brutality is somewhat missing in the Eastern Indian, particularly Bengali literature. Bengali literature is more influenced by a certain nostalgia about the lost land to which many of the writers apparently wish to return. Take, for example, the case of Sunil Ganguly. Sunil Ganguly has written on the partition or the consequences of the partition on the refugees or on West Bengal's urban life. You have this example of Purva Paschim. Even in that particular piece of writing, you can see the feeling of nostalgia. This feeling of nostalgia became much more articulate during 1971, when many of these intellectuals in Bengal felt that the barrier that was created in 1947 had at last been broken. Now, these differences that you see in the literary articulation of the memory of the partition, and this memory of the partition, of course, is associated with the memory of how they had to migrate, how they had to recreate their life.
So why these differences were there, like the between the experience of the East Punjab and West Bengal?
One answer should be that it is possible that the scale of violence in the Punjab was much greater. And that could be the reason why migration from West Punjab to East Punjab took place within a very short period of time, roughly between 1947 and 1948. The wholesale migration of the minorities from West Punjab, barring a few small communities, had taken place. The Hindu, Jat, and the Sikh peasants had migrated to East Punjab in search of a new home. But if you look at Bengal, in 1947, most of the migrants were relatively upper class migrants, belonging to the higher castes, belonging to the professional communities, people who felt insecure in a land where the Muslims were going to rule. I mean, it's a kind of a problem of changing power equation, forcing the more dominant sections of the East Bengal society to migrate as quickly as possible. But from 1950, peasants also began to migrate, low caste peasants, Namashudra peasants. You know the famous Namashudra leader Jogendranath Mandal, who remained in Pakistan with the hope that in the new state, these peasant communities were not going to be affected. But that was not the case, because from 1950 onwards, we begin to see the new wave of migration of peasants, rural people from the eastern Bengal countryside belonging to the lower castes, and that continued through the 1950s. You have periodic bouts of riots in Dir and East Pakistan, and you have a wave of migration. So, migration in eastern India, especially from East Pakistan to West Bengal, took place through a longer span of time, in different stages, and the waves of migration were linked with the bouts of riots and violence against minorities in East Pakistan. 1964, you may recall that riot following the Hazrat Bal incident, and that was also an occasion where a large number of Hindus had to migrate to West Bengal. Even in 1971, we can see and we saw an exodus of minorities. So that is certainly a very important difference. I mean, the experience of migration in eastern India was very different from the way migration took place in the Punjab. And I believe that such differences in the experience of migration are also reflected in the literature. The kind of brutality that you see in the North Indian literature is somewhat missing, even as it is true that the Bengali literature addressed this whole question of resettlement, revealing how difficult or how arduous the struggle was for the refugees to relocate themselves in a completely hostile and new environment. Many of these families were condemned or were looked upon as intruders, as Bangals. It created an identity problem in the 1960s, and you know that such identity problems were reflected through the Ghoti Bangal conflict. I mean, now it has become very relevant. But when we think of the 1950s and 60s, when the refugee settlements had begun to emerge in the neighborhood of Calcutta, the southern suburb of Calcutta, the northern suburb of Calcutta, possibilities of friction between local communities and such people who were migrating and settling down, often by forcibly occupying others' properties, such possibilities of friction were many. And this is adequately reflected in the Bengali literature. So, if we actually try to locate the resettlement experience, which is a part of this whole story of migration and resettlement, the experience of resettlement was also not uniform. There are significant differences between the Punjab and Bengal. In Punjab, the government took more concerted action. In Bengal, the policy was very lackadaisical. So, as we come to this question of resettlement, there is some connection with the experience of migration as well, because you see that if one set of people, however large they may be, the refugees, the 7 million of them who migrated from West Punjab to East Punjab, came at one point of time and put a burden on the state government, the state government had to respond to this problem with an element of grit, with certain kind of commitment to resettle them in this new environment. But for West Bengal, the problem was never resolved. It continued, it lingered for a longer time. And West Bengal's problems were compounded by the relative economic weaknesses of the state after the partition. We shall return to this question a little later, but let us first look at what was happening in the Punjab. Immediately after the partition, when millions of people started migrating, they crossed the border and settled down in the border districts, in the camps, in a very gruesome condition, in a barbaric condition. So it was important for the Punjab government to decide on how to disperse these refugees who were overcrowding these border areas into the interior of eastern Punjab. It called for a more concerted action, and the action that the East Punjab government took was to relocate these predominantly rural refugees in the property or in the land evacuated by the Muslims. This virtual exchange of population also implied that a large quantum of land would be vacated by people who had migrated to Pakistan. So the policy was to relocate them and resettle them, the rural refugees from West Punjab, in the land of the evacuees. Urban refugees, those belonging to trading communities of the professional classes, always had contacts on the other side, and they came to their relatives. The relatives gave them temporary shelter, and it was easier for the professional classes to settle down in a new environment. For the rural peasants, who were large in number, it was difficult. So, for the resettlement of this rural peasant population who were migrating to eastern Punjab, a concerted policy was necessary, particularly when many of these families had migrated earlier in the late 19th century from East Punjab to West Punjab to take advantage of the newly irrigated tracts opened up by the irrigation canals. So these were known as canal colonies, where this rural population was concentrated. Now it was for them again to come back to eastern Punjab, relatively arid region, food deficit region. So it was not a very easy task for the East Punjab government to resolve this problem. You have to relocate them in rural Punjab, mostly in the land of the evacuees. But then one has to make a calculation of the productivity of the soil as well. You have to consider the status of the different families. Some had greater amount of land, some had lesser amount of land. So they made a very elaborate blueprint by which initially, once they were taken out of these camps and relocated in the countryside, temporary allotments of land were made. Retail stores were opened for making available foodstuff for cheaper prices. Artisans were given loans in order to set up their business. You have these peasants who were provided with fodder, with livestock, with seeds, in order to carry on cultivation in the temporary allotments of land that the East Punjab government was making to these refugee families. But more importantly, they went a step forward than this by making allotments in accordance with the family holdings of these families in Pakistan. So they made graded allotments. People who were allotted land in relatively dry regions were given a larger quantum of land. People who had greater amount of land in Pakistan were also compensated proportionately, which actually to some extent fulfilled the demands of the migrant landowning classes. The emphasis, however, was to prevent absentee landlordism. They wished the refugees from Western Punjab, who were the great sturdy cultivators of the canal colonies, to rebuild Eastern Punjab's agriculture, to turn East Punjab into a thriving agricultural region. And these refugees ultimately succeeded in doing so. So they were encouraging with a certain degree of commitment the development of peasant enterprise. They guarded against the possibilities of absentee landlordism, and they made enough provision for these refugee peasants to start cultivation, which they did successfully. And the Vakra Dangal project, which was, as you know, completed in 1963, turned these settlements into irrigated settlements. So, the experience of Punjab with regard to resettlement of the predominantly rural peasant refugees has been fairly effective. It shows how these peasants were able ultimately to create a thriving agriculture in East Punjab. But when you come to Bengal, you see a difference. And to some extent, the kind of commitment that you see among the officials of East Punjab to relocate these people, homeless people in East Punjab effectively, was somewhat missing. There may be a large variety of reasons for this. For example, Pandit Nehru seriously believed that this was a passing phase. I mean, these people would eventually go back to their home in East Pakistan. Possibly he was late to this belief because the kind of brutal migration that was taking place in the western borders was not replicated here. Because as I have just told you that the migration experience had a long duration here.
Sir, what made the administration of West Bengal think that these migrants, they would return back?
It was a kind of a fond hope, partly because of the reason that West Bengal's economy by then had become a weak economy. They wished them to go back because it was inviting a tremendous pressure on an agriculture which was already overcrowded. There was a huge density of population in the agricultural districts of West Bengal. The possibility of creating new agricultural colonies in which these refugees would be settled was very remote. The second reason perhaps is that in 1947, these peasants didn't come, unlike in the Punjab where you have this huge scale of migration right from the beginning, and it ended by 1948. The migration of the rural people from eastern Pakistan started later. You can see this happening from 1950 onwards, as I was telling you. And once that began, I mean, the indications were clear by 1948, but during the early part of the 1950s, the scale of migration from East Pakistan to West Bengal was greater. So in 1948, the rehabilitation ministers from East Pakistan and India actually met in an inter-dominion conference and made their pledge to instill a feeling of security into the minds of the minorities on both sides of the border. But the fear didn't go. The rehabilitation ministers of India and Pakistan actually met and agreed to take adequate measures of security into the minds of the minorities on both sides of the border. But it had no effect. So in 1950, the Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru, and Liaquat Ali Khan, his counterpart in Pakistan, also reiterated the pledge through what is known as the Nehru-Liaquat Ali Pact. But this was also the time when the scale of rural migration from Eastern Bengal was on the rise, was increasing.
So how did these squatter colonies emerge in and around Calcutta?
That is the point. I mean, the squatters' colonies we can trace the history of many of these squatters' colonies from this time onwards. We will return to this point shortly, but let us first look at the problem that was unfolding in the early part of the decade of the 1950s. In a situation in which West Bengal as an economy was not in a position to carry this burden. As I have said, that further colonization was nearly impossible, and wherever refugees were settled in close proximity to existing agricultural settlements, there were possibilities of friction. Later in 1954, the Union Ministers Committee, a committee that was appointed by the Union government to inquire into the possibilities of resettling the peasant refugees, actually noted this point, that if the refugees were settled in the existing agricultural settlements, there are possibilities of friction. You have land-hungry peasants, and you don't have enough land for further colonization. Evacuee property was not so much that you can settle all these peasant refugees from Eastern Bengal in the same way the government in Punjab had been able to do that. So, the other option which the West Bengal government, arguing that the West Bengal economy had become a weak economy, there is no possibility of further colonization of land by the refugee settlers, reiterating the point that the jute mills were languishing, the jute economy had been affected by the partition because the jute growing areas were in East Bengal. So, on all these grounds, the West Bengal government started arguing that all the other states of India must also carry this burden. And so West Bengal government and the Union government had arrived at a consensus that refugees should be taken out of the state and settled in agricultural settlements outside of West Bengal, something which the refugees were not very willing to accept. The history of this migration is still to be written. You have enough scope for research on how they were taken from the railway stations to the camps. Camps were of different kinds. You have this famous Ranaghat Cooper's camp, which was a transit camp. There were permanent liability camps where the infirm, the old, and women were lodged. You have some worksite camps where certain attempts, however inadequate, were made by the government to provide them with some kind of training for purposes of employment. But the conditions in these camps were not very good, inhospitable in the first place. And second, they were put under some kind of a military control of the camp commandant. So there was always an urgency on the part of many of these inmates of the camps to sneak out of the camps and settle down independently in the vacant spot or the vacant space they would come across. So that is the origin of the squatters' colonies. I mean, rural settlement was not so easy. So the government was coming up with the idea of resettling them outside of the state, which they practiced with great resistance from the refugees. Public opinion was against it. Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who was the leader of the Refugee Rehabilitation Committee, actually complained that the refugees were being transported to a completely alien environment. They were taken away from their natural and cultural habitat. They argued that there was enough land in West Bengal where they could be settled. Refugee leaders who had now begun to organize and ultimately form the UCRC, the Central Refugee Council, they also came up with similar demands, arguing in favor of their resettlement in Bengal. You are all familiar with the way many of these refugees who had been taken out of West Bengal and settled in other areas wished to come back, and it led to conflicts. The Dandakaranya project, for example, which was initiated in 1958, was not a great success in the early stage. Shoibal Gupta, the man who was in charge of this project, in fact, had complained about the inadequacy of irrigation facilities. The soil conditions in Dandakaranya as elsewhere in the places where they were settled was poor. Irrigation was not adequate. Medical facilities were not available. So there was reason for the refugees to turn back to West Bengal, where there was resistance from the police. Such conditions led to very unseemly situation at many points of time, and the spillover you could see even in the later part of the 1970s. It is against this backdrop that you have to study the history of the self-settlement of the refugees in the squatters' colonies. Wherever they found vacant space, I mean, you have land held by landowners, but they were not staying there. So you have vacant land or vacant houses, they would actually go and settle down. This was happening in the northern suburb of Calcutta, also the southern suburb of Calcutta, present-day Jadavpur, Baghajoti, Najatgarh, on all these refugee colonies, which began to grow from 1950s onwards, actually tells you the story of how bravely, how dexterously the refugees settled themselves. They ultimately succeeded in bringing an element of civilization into a barbaric condition. They managed to create a civil society. Once they set up their colonies, they built their thatched houses, they created their refugee committees in which the refugee leaders provided leadership in laying down roads, in building schools, to bring about a semblance of civil society in a condition which was barbaric. So that is where the significance of the squatters' colonies actually lies. I mean, where the refugees were settling themselves, showing great enterprise, and eventually they became assimilated. But that is a later story. I mean, how they became assimilated within the mainstream society here is another matter. But the point to note at this moment is that much of the settlement that you see in West Bengal is the self-settlement undertaken by the refugees themselves. There was a certain amount of failure of the state. Even though we have memoirs of the refugee leaders regarding how they created these squatters' colonies, there is still enough scope for us to write the history of these colonies, which had a major impact on urban life in Calcutta and its neighborhood. So as we conclude this discussion, we have to note very clearly the very important distinction that we can make in the experience of migration between Punjab and Eastern India, the manner in which the Punjab government responded to the crisis more effectively than what happened in West Bengal, and the manner in which heroically the refugees settled themselves. And this self-settlement of the refugees is the discourse of hope in a situation of hopelessness.